Hello everybody. Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. In today's edition, we'll be discussing the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 5th December 2019. Topics to be discussed are displayed on the screen and timestamping for the same are given in the description box below. So let's start. Now this news appears in the context of the Union Cabinet's decision to approve the much needed data protection bill that seeks to usher in a data protection regime in India. Now, in this context, this news appears on page number 15 and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2 under the subsection Important Aspects of Governance, specially related to transparency and accountability. Now, as you must be aware, in the famous Puttaswamy case of 2017, the Supreme Court of India recognized what is known as right to privacy to be a part of fundamental right under Article 21, which laid the foundation for a need of data protection regime in India. Accordingly, the central government constituted what is known as Justice Sri Krishna Committee in order to recommend a suitable data protection law for India. Now, based on the recommendation, the draft Personal Data Protection Bill of 2018 was framed and was put in the public domain for feedback. Now, the Cabinet has approved the Personal Data Protection Bill, which will now be introduced in the Parliament for discussion and legislation. Now, prima facie, this bill tries to strike a balance between the right to privacy of an individual and needs of a digital economy. Now, the revolution in ICT in the form of e-commerce, big data, social media, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, etc. has made the digital data the new engine of growth in the 21st century. Now, given the size of digital data that is produced, where this data is generated, where it is collected, where it is stored, and how it is used has long-term repercussions for the national economies. Now, for instance, whenever a message on a social media platform is posted or a product is bought on an e-commerce website or any online transaction for that matter, the following aspects of the data flow becomes extremely relevant. In that, the important questions with respect to data flow include what is the nature of data that is generated, where is it stored, and who uses this data that is so generated. Now, these questions determines effectively who owns the data, who profits from the data, and what are its implications on a nation's economy as a whole. Now, given the importance of these questions in the growing digital economy and at the same time increasing recognition to right to privacy of the individual, a personal data protection bill setting the data protection regime in India was necessary, and this bill caters to such a purpose. Now, accordingly, the data protection bill that has been approved by the Union Cabinet has the following components, including regulation of data collection, data storage, and how is this data processed. Besides, this bill is applicable to any entity that offers goods or services to Indian residents or processes the personal data of Indian residents irrespective of their physical address. Now, having understood the need for a data protection regime and the importance of the data protection bill, let us look at some of the important provisions of this data protection bill that has got the cabinet nod. Now, basically, any data protection law or data protection regimes primarily revolve around four basic issues, including data localization that determines where the data is stored and processed. Now, this is because data is an asset, and who owns the data and who profits from the data has widespread repercussions on the nation's economy. With recent impetus on right to privacy, the consent of the individual becomes the second most important issue. With an extensive scope for data breach and data leaks, compliance becomes the third most important issue. And given the cross-border nature of the data flow and importance of national security, exceptions to some of these provisions also form an important part of any data protection regime. So let us look at these provisions one by one. For the purposes of data localization, the bill basically differentiates personal data into three categories, namely general personal data, sensitive personal data, and critical personal data. Now, in case of general personal data, the bill allows for storage and processing of general personal data without the need for having a copy of the data in India, which effectively means data localization is not required in case of general personal data. Now, on the other hand, the bill has classified some data as sensitive personal data like passwords, financial data, health data, sexual orientation, biometric data, etc., which requires data localization, meaning which this data shall be stored only in India. Now, coming to the processing of data, on the other hand, the entities can process this sensitive personal data only with the consent of the individual and approval by a data protection authority constituted for the purpose. Now, besides, the bill also empowers the central government to notify certain data as critical personal data, requiring both storage and processing of this critical personal data to be solely located within the national boundaries of India. As to what constitutes this critical personal data will be notified by the central government from time to time, and such personal data shall be stored and processed only in India, meaning which data localization is required even for critical personal data. Now, in short, recognizing the need for growth of digital economy and a wide user base in India, the government, in comparison with the draft bill of 2018, has relaxed some conditions with respect to data localization, in that it has allowed general personal data to be stored and processed outside the country. At the same time, respecting the right to privacy, the bill restricts sensitive personal data and critical personal data to be stored only in India. Now, besides, the bill provides for mandatory consent of the individual for processing of any kind of personal data, protecting the right to privacy of the individual. Now, in order to ensure compliance to the data protection law, the bill provides for penalty for violation, in that the sharing or processing of data in contravention to what is provided by the law will attract a fine of 15 crores or 4% of the global turnover of the company, whichever is higher. Besides, in case of data leak or inaction, which does not necessarily mean that the company has deliberately violated the law, also attracts a penalty, but to a lesser degree, of 5 crores or 2% of the global turnover, whichever is higher. Now, besides, the government is empowered to gain access to any non-personal data like traffic patterns or demographic information, mainly for better delivery of public services or evidence-based policy making, and also for the purposes of national security or preventing unlawful activities and investigation and prosecution of such cases. The government is empowered to access any information from the companies, which will then process this data without the consent of the individual. Now, this is in line with the recent notification of the central government, which authorized 10 central agencies, including RAW, IB, CBI, etc., to intercept, monitor, and decrypt any information generated, transmitted, or received in the interest of sovereignty or integrity of India and to maintain public order. Now, this rule of data interception was notified by the Ministry of Home Affairs under Rule 69(1) of the Information Technology Act. Besides, with respect to companies, it is mandatory for the companies to adopt some form of user verification in order to curb the menace of fake news. Thus, by making it mandatory for the companies to do some sort of user verification, now this provision of the bill is in line with the recent need for social media regulation that is in vogue for curbing the menace of fake news in India. Besides, as we have already seen, in order to ensure compliance, the bill also provides for penalty for violation. Now, with respect to the consumer, by making the consent of the individual mandatory for processing of any kind of data, the bill seeks to protect the right to privacy. It also provides for safeguards against misuse by providing for penalty for violation. Besides, by categorizing the different types of personal data, the bill also protects the sensitive and critical personal data by having a mandatory data localization norms. Now that the cabinet has given the nod to this bill, now we will take up the issues related to the bill as and when they are raised in the parliament discussions till the final passage of the bill. Now with this, let's move to the next news. Now in line with its policy of disinvestment and creating an additional source of funding for the central public sector enterprises, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has approved the establishment of an exchange-traded fund known as Bharat Bond, which will be India's first bond-based exchange-traded fund that will be traded in the secondary market. Now, in this context, this news appears on page number 15 and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 3 under the head Mobilization of Resources. Besides, the basic concept behind exchange traded fund is also important from the perspective of preliminary examination. Now, before we look into the features of this Bharat Bond exchange traded fund, let us understand what is exchange traded fund. Now, the exchange traded fund is basically a fund that is created out of pooled assets, something similar to a mutual fund. Now, as you can see here, the exchange traded fund is created by pooling together different assets that could be a share of a company, a bond, a foreign currency, etc. Now, once these assets are pooled together and cumulated to form an exchange traded fund, this cumulated asset is then divided into unit value similar to a share, which is then traded in the secondary market. Now, it is important to note that the value of this exchange traded fund comes from the value of these underlying assets, which, as I said, could be a share of a company, which basically means equity. The underlying asset could be a bond or a foreign currency. Now, this Bharat bond, which is being launched by the government, is basically a bond-based exchange-traded fund. In that, the Bharat bond exchange-traded fund is basically formed by pooling together the bonds of different public sector enterprises, and this cumulated exchange-traded fund is then divided into unit pieces, which are basically traded on a secondary market, just like shares. Now, because these exchange traded funds comprises of shares of different companies, they are also known as index funds. Now, having understood the basic principle behind exchange traded fund, let us see the difference between exchange traded fund and mutual fund. Now, as I have already mentioned, both exchange traded fund and mutual funds are pooled assets in that the fund is created by accumulating assets of different companies. However, these two differ with respect to the tradability, in that while buying and selling of mutual fund means that you are directly transacting with the fund, buying and selling of exchange traded fund on the other hand is just like buying and selling of shares. Further, while mutual fund is basically managed by fund managers, the exchange traded funds are managed by the investor himself. Besides, while mutual fund is bought and sold at a price of shares at the close of the day, exchange traded funds are basically traded throughout the day, thereby giving liquidity and marketability to exchange traded funds. Now, having understood the difference between exchange traded funds and mutual funds, let us look at some of the features of this Bharat Bond exchange traded fund. Now, as I have already stated, Bharat Bond Exchange Traded Fund is a bond-based exchange traded fund, in that it is a basket of bonds basically issued by the central public sector enterprises, the central public sector undertakings, and some financial institutions or any other government organization bonds. Now, in order to attract the retail investors, this Bharat Bond has a very small unit size of 1000 rupees. Now, besides, since these instruments are created out of government bonds, these are extremely safe. Now, given the characteristic of tradability of exchange traded fund on the secondary market, these funds are extremely liquid. Besides, since the unit value is only rupees 1000, it provides for easy and low cost access to bond markets to retail investors who are currently not participating in the bond market. Now, as to benefits to the central public sector enterprises, It provides an additional source of funding in addition to the bank finances. It widens the investor base of these central public sector enterprises. Besides, due to the low unit value and consequent increase in demand for these bonds, the cost of borrowing for central public sector enterprises will be extremely low. Now, as a result of these advantages, the overall bond markets are expected to deepen with enhanced retail participation and finally reduced borrowing costs for the central public sector enterprises. Now, as I have mentioned, this topic becomes important from the perspective of both prelims and mains exam, both in terms of concept of exchange traded funds and also the features of Bharat bond. Now, with this, let's move to the next topic. Now, this news relates to the Global Climate Risk Index 2020, in that India is ranked 5th among the countries that are most affected by climate change in 2018. Now, this news appears on page number 14 and becomes important from the perspective of a preliminary examination, where often questions based on indices and related organizations are asked. Now, what I have done here is collated the information that is important from the perspective of prelims examination. Now, this index is published by an international environment think tank called German Watch. Besides, the Global Climate Risk Index is based on 4 indicators, including the total number of deaths due to climate change related weather phenomena, the total number of deaths per lakh population, the economic cost in PPP terms, and finally economic cost per unit of GDP of a country. Now, based on the measurement of these indicators in the year 2018, the Global Climate Risk Index 2020 is published. Besides, this index has 2 components, including a short-term one which is based on annual measurements and a long-term one based on long-term vulnerabilities that is factored for about 20-year period. Now, having seen some of the key facts related to Global Climate Risk Index, let us see some of the highlights of this year's report. Now, the global scenario based on the 2018 measurements indicate that Japan was the most vulnerable country based on climate change related weather phenomena, followed by Philippines, Germany and Madagascar. Besides, the report also highlights that the poor and vulnerable countries are the most affected by climate change. Besides, industrialized countries like Japan and Germany were hardest hit as a result of extreme heat waves and severe droughts in 2018. Now, based on the 20-year period data, 7 of the 10 most affected countries include countries with lower per capita income. In that, Puerto Rico is the most vulnerable, followed by Myanmar, Haiti, Philippines and Pakistan. Besides, the report also highlighted there were about 5 lakh fatalities in the last 20 years linked to about 12,000 extreme weather events due to climate change. And this resulted in an economic loss of about $3.54 trillion according to the report. Now, a look at the Indian scenario shows that India has slipped to 5th rank compared to 15th rank in 2017 in the annual index. In terms of long-term vulnerability, India is ranked 17th in the 20-year period spanning 1999 to 2018. Now, the most important reasons for India's worsening in ranking include severe rainfall followed by heavy flooding, particularly that of Kerala in 2018. Besides, India was also hit by 2 cyclones, namely Titli and Gaja in October and November 2018, that also killed about 1,000 people. Now, extreme heat is also identified as another key reason for India's dismal performance in 2018. Besides, the result has highlighted that India recorded highest number of fatalities due to climate change in 2018 and second highest monetary losses due to climate change in 2018. Now, in this context, the ongoing COP25 at Madrid is extremely important because for the first time, the impetus to financial support for climate-related losses and damage, including damage on human lives, land and culture, is being addressed at the global level. Now, apart from being important from prelims perspective, you can also use this data in some of your answers related to climate change in the mains examination. Now, with this, let's move to the next news. Now, this news appears in the context of dismal performance of the PM-AASHA scheme that was launched in 2018, in that only 3% of the targeted procurement has happened in cases of pulses and oil seeds under the scheme in the last year. Now, in this context, this news appears on page number 9 under the head Government Procured only 3% of pulses oil seeds proposed for this season, and becomes important from the perspective of both preliminary and mains examination under the subtopic issues related to minimum support prices. Now, before we look into this news analysis, let us have a look at the background of PM-AASHA scheme that was launched in 2018. Now, PM-AASHA or PM Annadata Aay Saurakshan Abhiyan was launched in September 2018 as an umbrella scheme for different mechanisms to ensure that the farmers get the minimum support price for select crops including pulses and oilseeds. In that, the PM-AASHA had three components including a price support scheme, a price deficiency payment scheme, and a private procurement and stockist scheme in order to ensure the farmers get a minimum support price. Now, the price support scheme provides for physical procurement of the crops in that the government agencies will physically procure pulses, oilseeds and copra from the farmers at MSP. Now, the nodal agencies for physical procurement of these crops include NAFED and Food Corporation of India. Besides, the cost of procurement and losses, if any, will be borne by the central government under the price support scheme. Now, the next component includes price deficiency payment scheme, under which there is no physical procurement. Instead, whenever the price dips of the select crops, the difference amount, that is the MSP minus the selling price, shall be paid by the government. The eligible crops include oil seeds, and under this scheme, farmers who are selling their produce at a lower price than MSP shall be pre-registered. Now, the next of the component is pilot of private procurement and stockist scheme. Now, under this scheme, while there is a provision for physical procurement, this procurement is done by private agencies which are selected by the state government. Now, the private agent who is selected for procurement will be compensated in the form of a service charge of maximum 15% of the minimum support price. Now, the eligible crops again include all oil seeds. Therefore, through different strategies, PM-AASHA ensures that the farmers get a minimum support price, particularly for pulses and oil seeds. Now, as to impact of the scheme, it ensures a remunerative price for the farmer and therefore augment farmers' income, thereby reducing overall farm distress in Indian agriculture. While much was expected out of the ambitious scheme, according to the recent reports, PM-AASHA has failed to reach its targets in that only 3% of the targeted procurement has happened in the last year. Now, the main reasons identified for this dismal performance is on account of failure of states in procurement and also late monsoon. Now, it is identified that 3 of the 11 states that have opted for the scheme, including UP, Madhya Pradesh and Odisha, has not even started the procurement process. Now, besides, the late arrival of monsoon meant that the harvests and the crop arrivals also began slightly later than expected, and therefore the procurement process has not started. As a result, the government has decided to continue the procurement process until February next year, which is expected to increase the procurement level, although it may not result in meeting of the targets. Now, in this context, this news becomes important mainly from the prelims examination perspective. Thus, the components of this scheme are extremely important, as we have seen. Now, with this, let's move to the next news. Now, this article appears on page number 11 and relates to some of the structural issues ailing the Indian higher education system. Now, this article appears in the context of recent demand for restoration of the higher education subsidies in JNU. Now, in this article, the author highlights various issues that are ailing the higher education system and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2 under the subsection Issues Relating to Education in India. Now, in this news analysis, what we will do is we will look at the issues and challenges in Indian higher education system as a whole and some of the steps that have been taken by the government in order to address these issues. And we will also look at the way forward as recommended by the new education policy of 2019. Now, first among the issues that is ailing the higher education system in India is extremely low enrollment ratios, in that the All India Survey of Higher Education of Ministry of HRD has highlighted that the gross enrollment ratio in higher education in India is about 25.2%, and this is in comparison with about 44% in China and 80% in US. Now, low gross enrollment ratio is an account of lack of access to higher education institutions. Besides, the higher education system in India is fraught with extreme shortage of faculty, in that in 2017 the shortage of faculty according to MHRD data was around 35%, with an extremely low student teacher ratio of about 1:20. Besides, the higher education system in India, particularly the state universities, are of low quality, and with 94% of the students enrolled in these state universities, which provide low quality higher education, contribute to the overall low quality of higher education in India. Now, it should be noted that the structure of higher education in India is made up of 1. The central universities, 2. The state universities, 3. Deemed universities, which are aided and unaided, and finally the private universities. Now, out of the 800 odd universities in India, the state universities constitute about 370 universities, out of which only 106 state universities were accredited by the NAAC as of 2012. Now, this further highlights the lack of quality in state universities. Besides, with most of the funding of the central government skewed towards central universities and institutes like IITs and IIMs, the state universities are also ailing with inadequate infrastructure, and the lack of sync between the curricula of higher education institutions and the industry requirements is reflected in the fact that about 47% of the graduates in India are considered unemployable. Besides, the higher education regulation in India is fraught with the heavy hands of multiple regulators like UGC, AICTE, etc. Now, accordingly, the government has taken a number of steps in order to address few of these issues, starting with Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan, which is considered to be a landmark scheme that was launched in 2013. Now, this scheme primarily aimed at funding of state universities which are ailing with shortage of faculty, lack of quality, as we have seen. And this scheme, by linking performance with funding, has played a key role in improving access, quality, and equity in higher education, particularly in state universities. The key areas of focus under RUSA is governance, infrastructure, enrollment, and teacher training. Besides, the central government has recently launched the EQUIP program, which is short for Education Quality Upgradation and Inclusion Program, that aims to improve access and quality in higher education over the next 5 years. Now, this is sought to be achieved by way of a market-based funding through a higher education finance agency that will raise about 1 lakh crore for infrastructure improvement in higher education. Besides, the central government is also contemplating on introducing a Higher Education Commission of India bill that seeks to repeal the UGC Act and subsume the multiple regulators in higher education into a single uniform regulator. Besides, the HESI will also separate the academic and the grants functions of a regulator, thereby promoting autonomy of higher education institutions. Besides, the Ministry of HRD has also launched a scheme for promoting research in India called SPARK, which is short for Scheme for Promotion of Academic and Research Collaboration. Now, in addition to these steps, as a way forward, the National Education Policy of 2019 provides for the following recommendations, in that the National Education Policy envisages a complete restructuring of the pedagogy of higher education in India, with higher education institution being structured into Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 institutions, with Tier 1 institution focusing on research and training, the Tier 2 institutions focusing on professional courses in order to make the students industry ready, Besides, it also provides for a tier 3 institution which focuses on promotion of higher education in liberal arts in the country. Besides, the national education policy also has set a target of increasing the gross enrollment ratio to at least 50% by 2035, which is currently at around 25%. Besides, in order to improve the research ecosystem in India, it envisages the establishment of a national research foundation with dedicated funding for research in India. Now, while I have highlighted only the important aspects of the different steps taken by the government, the details of these schemes are given in the PDF and you may go through the same. Now, with this, let's move to the next news. Now, this article appears on page number 1 in the context of the Cabinet's approval for the Citizenship Amendment Bill 2019. Besides, it is important to note that the bill will not apply to the tribal areas of Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Tripura, and the issue of citizenship bill was comprehensively covered in the DNS analysis of 1st December 2019 by Vaibhav sir. So I suggest you go through the DNS analysis of 1st December 2019, the link for which will be given in the description below. Now, based on our discussion today, let's take up these practice questions. Now, the first of this question is, which of the following institutions publishes the Global Climate Risk Index? The right answer is German Watch, as we have seen, and therefore C is the right answer. Now, coming to question number 2, which of the following is correct with respect to PM-AASHA? PM-AASHA provides for both physical procurement and price differential in case of price dip, which is true. Further, PM-AASHA has a provision of procurement by government agencies only, which is not true, because PM-AASHA also provides for procurement by private agencies under the pilot of a private procurement and stockist scheme, as we have seen. Therefore, the correct option is A, 1 only. Now, coming to the third question, consider the following statements. Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan seeks to improve funding in central universities, which is false. As we have seen, Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan seeks to improve funding in state universities. Further, the proposed Higher Education Commission of India is set to subsume Medical Council of India within its ambit, which is also wrong because medical education is exempt from this single unified regulator in the higher education sector. Therefore, the right option is D, neither 1 nor 2. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Now, let's take up the question of the day.